Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 562XP chainsaw. The customer complaint is that it wouldn't start. Now this saw has already been diagnosed as needing an ignition module, so that's what we're going to do here in this video. You'll see we've got the starter rewind mechanism removed from the saw. Now we're pulling the top cover. Off comes the spark plug boot. The air conductor will feed the spark plug wire out around the frame of the chassis of the saw, and pop a couple of screws for the ignition module itself. Now with these newer 5 series saws, some of them the wiring for the ignition module runs behind the flywheel. Kind of a pain in the butt when you got to replace the ignition module. But it is what it is, right? This little piece here we're removing is called an air nozzle. It directs air from the fan of the flywheel up to the carburetor area. Here's our new module. You can see it's got a complete wiring harness on it. We're going to need a 13mm socket on the end of this Ugga impact. And what I'm doing is backing that nut flush with the end of the crankshaft. So when I smack it with a hammer, I'm not wrecking any threads on the crankshaft. Just putting a little pressure behind the flywheel, nothing crazy. And giving it a tap. You see there's a cut in the video because I tapped it like 3 times before that. But video's going to be long enough. I'll blow a little bit of debris out from behind here. This new style air filter on the 562 is way better than that old style they had with the just the bail clip that held the filter down. Now we've got a decent seal and a threaded air filter. So there's a couple of rubber saddles that this air filter holder locks into. We're just popping it out of there. And this white connector is for our auto tune. It runs between the carburetor and the ignition module. It's snapped into a little holder on the side of the carb there. And we're trying to cheat. We're trying to get that wiring harness out without removing the carburetor. And I try every time I do one of these, and I always end up having to remove the carburetor. It just makes it easier. I should just start that way, I'd save time. So at the end of that wiring harness, there's also a ground wire, and that screw that I'm on right now goes through an eyelet on that ground wire. If you look close down on the bench, down by the razor blade there, you can see the eyelet on the new ignition coil wiring harness. So this wire won't just pull out of here, and the reason for that is it's sitting in a little bit of a hook or a holder. So there I've disconnected the 2 halves of the white connector, and in a second here you're going to see that holder I'm talking about. So out come the 2 screws that hold the airbox and the carburetor on. And the choke lever is kind of hooked underneath the choke linkage on the carburetor. But this wire right here, white connector, sits in a saddle. Let's see if we can get an eyeball on this or not. It's pretty dark down there. Well, I'm right next to it and I can't see it. There we go. Right there. It's just sitting in a little bit of a hook. So you can't just pull it straight out. It's got to be lifted up out of that hook before it'll come out through the side of the crankcase here. New one goes right in. And it might need some help being fed through there. And we also have that ground wire with the eyelet on it. What I'm doing now is trying to push that all the way over to this side of the chainsaw. And when you take that eyelet off of there, take a close look at how it's setting in a little bit of a saddle. And they designed this saddle so that the eyelet won't spin when you crank it down. There's kind of a couple of pegs on each side of the terminal itself. So you can crank on it and it's not going to spin around and tighten or torque on the wire or anything stupid like that. Alright, we'll take something sharp and push that wiring harness down into that saddle. I don't know why I don't just leave a plastic pry bar sitting on the bench when I'm doing this. And with our wiring harness laying in place, we'll reinstall the screw that holds that harness down. Okay, our white connector gets snapped back together. Can only go one way. Seems to be a lot of fumbling around on this one. Now the white connector gets snapped into its holder. And then we're going to reinstall the carburetor. Everything goes back together just the way it came apart. You do have to pay attention to the choke lever. There's a little wire spring, and that has to be, I think it goes underneath the lever on the carburetor, so that when you push down the stop lever, it's spring loaded. Alright, everything looks like it's lined up pretty decent. We're just getting our fuel return line in place, poking at it with a sharp screwdriver again. Our fuel feed line from the carburetor to the purge bulb, that went on. And then we'll hand tighten down the carburetor. The rubber saddles for the air filter holder. And just a little bit of a function check. And make sure we got that spring the right way for the choke and stop lever. Make sure our trigger lever works properly. And then we put the air filter on. Alright, let's get that ignition coil temporarily mounted. We're going to just snug these screws down so that the coil is basically back far enough to make clearance for the flywheel to go on. And we'll adjust the gap afterwards. Get the keyway lined up, put the nut on. I don't have the torque specs for you on this nut. And then our air nozzle goes back into place. Now, if you're wondering about auto tune and programming for the new ignition module, if you're replacing an exact same part number ignition module, then you don't have to do any programming. If you're using an upgraded module, then after the fact here, you would have to hook this up to common service tool that your dealer would have and reprogram the auto tune. We're using the exact same part number module, so we won't have to do any of that. Here we're just setting our module air gap. Feed our plug wire through. Get our air conductor laying down in place. Be careful with this. You want to make sure it's perfectly flush. You know, it'll go in there and it'll sit a little bit wonky sometimes. You just got to keep manipulating this thing until it lays just right. Once you've got it there, then tuck the spark plug lead into the tabs on it to hold it in place. Same thing goes for the starter. See how it's kind of wobbly right here? It's not sitting flush at all. Just keep working it until you get it to sit flush, because if you crank it down when it's wobbly, you're going to break something. Get that starter cranked down. Get our spark plug wire back in place. There's a little holder right there for the lead. We'll get the top cover on here and get some fuel in it. Get this thing buttoned up and give it a test run. See if that's all it really needed was a module. So that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 562XP ignition module swap. Thanks for watching. Later.